In an October 2025 announcement, Wizards of the Coast floated the idea of a change to the way hybrid mana is treated in the deck-building rules of EDH. This caused quite a lot of discourse, which I laid out some thoughts to in a previous video that was uncontroversial and universally beloved by the EDH community. However, that October 2025 announcement also featured some other things, one of which was the proposing of the banning of Rhystic Study, the powerful blue draw engine. That particular card has been in a perpetual state of low-level controversy for some years now, being both the third most widely played blue card, but also the second most hated blue card according to salt polls conducted by EDH Rec. And I won't bury the lead here. I don't like this card, and I absolutely think it should be banned. However, my reasons for thinking that are different than those of a lot of people, and I actually think that this card and the discourse around it is a fascinating window into some of the grittier instincts of EDH players, the ones we don't like to think about or talk about. At the end of the day, Rhystic Study's power level is certainly quite high, but the destructive social dynamics it creates are the more pernicious element of the card, and these two factors combine to make it a card that absolutely warrants a ban. To start with, though, we need to understand what it is we're talking about. Why is it that a card should be banned in EDH? After all, it's a casual format. A lot of the usual rules of tournament frequency and meta dominance don't really apply. We can look at the current ban list as well as other actions taken against specific cards to start to paint a picture. I choose to begin in a familiar place. Yuriko the Tiger's Shadow is a card that spent 7 months on the Game Changers list last year. It was eventually delisted under the reasoning that a Rule 0 tool like the Game Changers list is far less necessary for policing commander cards, which are visible at the outset of a game. But Yuriko still works nicely as an example of a card that sometimes feels problematic in EDH. As I laid out a couple months ago, Yuriko feeling problematic comes down to two things. For one, she is efficient and powerful, being very cheap to play and providing a ton of utility through her mixture of damage and card draw. Secondly, her play pattern is frustrating. Since her Commander Ninjutsu ability dodges commander attacks, it is quite hard to keep her off the board, and it often feels like the Yuriko player effectively gets to cheat the normal rules of the format. So these are typically the two things required to make a card truly problematic: a high power level and a play pattern that is frustrating. We can see this echoed in some cards on the ban list. Hullbreacher and Leovold are efficiently costed creatures, and they also easily combine with wheels to blast away opposing hands. Primeval Titan and 15 mana Emrakul are both high-quality bombs that would see wide play if legal, and their abilities also let their controller rapidly snowball and end up playing a lot more Magic than opponents. We can even see this in the fast mana bans of 2024. Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus are obviously very powerful, and the fact that they allow such explosive turn 1 plays can be frustrating and disempowering for opponents in a way that some other powerful cards might not be. Not everything currently on the ban list or the Game Changer list perfectly fits this framework, but this power level plus play pattern pairing is still a decently reliable template. For something to be worth banning in EDH in the year of our Lord 2026, it needs to be frustrating in a way that creates bad experiences for people, and it also needs to be powerful enough to see wide play and make that bad experience commonplace, so as to actually warrant a ban rather than just being an occasional annoyance. As we will see shortly, Rhystic Study checks both of these boxes. To start with, let's talk power level. On an objective level, Rhystic Study's power level is quite high, and this is evident in the fact that it's one of the best cards in CEDH. Surely these expert gamers know how to play around this bad boy, right? But no, Rhystic Study is quite powerful even if all your opponents are being tactical about paying the 1. If somebody wants to cast a piece of interaction that spends all their mana, they're not going to be paying the 1. If somebody has a pivotal play on their turn and no extra mana to pay, the correct choice is to play the card and let the Rhystic Study player draw, not to skip your own turn. There are all sorts of cases in which it is absolutely the correct choice not to pay the 1, and that makes Rhystic Study a pretty great draw engine on base. Now, as you move down in power level, decks will get a bit less lean, have spare mana a bit more often, and cast fewer overall spells each turn. If I'm being generous, I think this is where a lot of people get the idea that Rhystic Study isn't really problematic after all. It does scale with power level to some extent, especially when we consider that the maximum card draw in a game with 3 spells per player per turn cycle is significantly more than in a game with 1 to 2 spells per player per turn cycle. However, this still misses some things. For one, at bracket 3, cards are going to cost more mana typically. Whereas an engine in CEDH might be 2 or 3 mana, it's pretty common to see engines in bracket 3 that cost 4 or 5 mana. And if you only have 4 or 5 mana to work with, one of these cards is going to be much more possible to pay the tax on than the other. This is true for engines, and it also certainly applies to removal. A lot of people will make the argument that Rhystic Study can be answered by simply removing it, but this misses two key things. For one, you can say this about basically any problematic permanent, but there are still very good reasons to ban permanents. Prophet of Kruphix is a piddly little creature that can be removed far more easily than Rhystic Study, but there are still very good reasons for it to stay banned. Just remove it is a strategy you can employ, just as making somebody the archenemy is a strategy you can employ, but neither of these things are arguments to keep a card legal on the scale of a format-wide ban list. Secondly, any removal spells cast on Rhystic Study are themselves Rhystic taxed. Best case scenario, it costs an opponent a mana, but if the removal isn't super mana cheap, there's a good chance that the Rhystic Studying player will get a card as well. And that's all assuming that the blue player isn't prepared to play counterspells in defense of their copy of the most powerful draw engine in the format. In the land of reality, counterspells frequently are present, and any multi-spell fight over whether a Rhystic Study stays on board will often itself draw the studying player a lot of cards. There are also people who will downplay the severity of a Rhystic Study sticking around on board. A lot of pro-Rhystic folks will casually present Rhystic Study as a one-sided sphere of resistance. Like, come on bro, if you just pay the 1, it's only 3 mana to make all opposing spells cost 1 more, a tax tool more powerful than any other that has ever existed. It's not that bad. This is just patently absurd. A 3-mana one-sided sphere of resistance is obviously good, and there's a reason Grand Arbiter Augustin IV is such a salty card, even as a 4-mana multicolor card. I think all of what I just said is pretty reasonable, but I also worry that my engaging with the one-sided sphere of resistance talk legitimizes it in a way that it absolutely does not deserve. Rhystic Study would be an extremely powerful magic card if it was a one-sided sphere of resistance, but it is not that, and this is where this video is going to really start to diverge from most critiques of the card I've seen. To start with, let's just establish that people will inevitably end up giving the studying player cards for any number of reasons. I laid out a couple reasons earlier that frequently apply to CEDH, and these reasons arguably strengthen at lower levels. Just pay the 1 can be a sensible strategy when a deck features high-quality plays at multiple mana values. Like, if you're forced to play a 3-mana ramp spell instead of a 4-mana amplifier, that might not really be a huge hit to your game plan. On the other hand, if your deck has a wider spread of mana values and card effects, paying the 1 could keep you away from a critical play that you really need on a particular turn. This effect is further amplified when there are power level differences present. If one player has a deck that is less tuned, whose ramp isn't as well calibrated, and whose plays are less mana efficient, that player is going to be hit harder by the Rhystic Study tax. Ditto for somebody who gets unlucky or keeps a subpar hand. Anyone who misses land drops or fumbles their setup turns is going to be much less able to spare mana for Rhystic Study, and being pressured to do so on a critical turn might, in one fell swoop, destroy any chance they had of catching back up. I say pressure because Rhystic Study-esque effects frequently come with a dose of social pressure not to feed the studying player too many resources. This fact can feel pretty reasonable on the surface, but this pressure to pay will be experienced very differently by different players. The players most harmed by needing to pay an extra 1 for their spells will be, on average, the less experienced players piloting the less powerful decks and getting less lucky, and whether or not these players are pushed into ruining their own game plan may come down to how they react to the social forces at play. With this in mind, the just pay the 1 lol crowd starts to appear in a somewhat different light. In a weird way, arguments in defense of Rhystic Study often end up very similar to conservative economic arguments in favor of the status quo. Hear me out on this one. Let's imagine somebody trying to introduce a policy in a society with a lot of economic inequality. John Allocation says, "We should implement my tax credit plan, as it will give all the people of this great nation more of a fighting chance at succeeding in this economy and joining the middle class." This is an economic argument, and whether it's likely to do what John says it will do can be determined by digging into the details, running some models, and whatever else economists do. Now let's imagine John's political rival has something to say about that. Jeff Business says, "This economy already gives citizens a fighting chance at joining the middle class. Just look at all the hardworking people who have already succeeded." In a society with a lot of inequality, this is not an economic argument. This is a moral argument. The people currently below the middle class indisputably exist, and rather than asking why that is or what can be done to help them, Jeff Business is instead choosing to turn them into an outgroup to be ignored. His implied message is that there is something wrong with the people who are currently poor, that they are less deserving, that they have been given opportunities and squandered them, that they have earned their shake in life. It wouldn't matter if John Allocation's tax credit had been highly successful at helping people elsewhere in the world. Here, it would be disrupting a divine order that has put this pathetic outgroup in their correct place. It is an argument in favor of human suffering based on the idea that those people have earned that suffering and no longer deserve our consideration. When somebody says, Rhystic Study isn't that good, people just need to pay the one, they're making a very similar argument, if a less consequential one. Not saying they're identical, nor that these are patterns of thought held by all Rhystic Study defenders, or all conservatives for that matter, but there's a strong resemblance. What I mean by that is this: if telling everybody to just pay the one was actually a successful strategy for making Rhystic Study a fair and enjoyable Magic card, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The fact that it's not a solution, that it's an unhelpful thing to say, is already proven by the observable facts that surround us, namely that Rhystic Study is a very powerful card at all levels of EDH. Every day, thousands of Magic players don't pay the one, and there are a variety of different reasons for that. As I suggested earlier, some of them are playing a weak deck, or having a weak game with their deck, and playing a couple cards into the Rhystic Study is the only way to keep up. Or maybe they're newer to the game, and don't have a firm grasp on the power level of an engine like Rhystic Study, as suggested by the Trinket Mage in his video on the subject. Maybe they're overwhelmed by the current state of the game, and choose to go about their turns ignoring Rhystic Study for that reason, only paying when doing so is a convenient afterthought. Maybe somebody sees other players not paying the one for any of the previous reasons, and decides that it's time for them to stop paying as well. This is the reality of Rhystic Study, not the quippy hypothetical of a smug power gamer. You can make some sort of argument toward educating people about playing against the card, just as an economic conservative might meekly gesture toward the importance of teaching people to budget, but all four of the situations I described earlier will continue to exist no matter how high a rooftop you yell, "Just pay the one," from. Rhystic Study is fine, people just need to pay the one, is not an argument about game balance, it is a moral argument about the people currently not paying the one. So, if saying just pay the one isn't a helpful solution to the problem of Rhystic Study, why do people say it? Well, one answer to this is pretty simple. Taking this stance solidifies hierarchies in the EDH community in a way that some people find emotionally satisfying. It forges an in-group to be a part of, genius gamers who understand Rhystic Study, and an out-group to be scorned, everybody else. On a basic level, this is kinda inevitable. Tribalism is a folly pretty inherent to being human, and the fact that it shows up in a card game whose formats are traditionally competitive isn't much of a surprise. Where things start to get hairy is when these sorts of social forces worm their way into the basic operation of a Commander game, and this is precisely what Rhystic Study encourages. Players not paying, a thing that happens frequently for a wide variety of reasons, can become treated as a crime, punishable in-game and out-of-game. Frustrations grow, resentments smolder, a game ends up feeling unsatisfying for one reason or another. One player's attempt to have any shot at their own game plan working suddenly gets seen as them handing the game to another player out of their own foolishness, and they are often derided as such. And you know what? Sometimes those deriders are right. Many a Rhystic Studying player has been brought to victory through the power of opponents feeding them too many cards. But the line here is blurry. The difference between a player handing another the win and a player just trying to play the game they showed up to play, just trying not to fall too far behind in tempo to have any shot, it can be pretty ambiguous. However, acknowledging that ambiguity, acknowledging that Rhystic Study frequently puts opponents in a lose-lose scenario where even the quote-unquote correct choice isn't all that correct, well, it makes it too obvious just how powerful the card is. This is precisely why a lot of Rhystic Study defenders frame the issue in such black and white terms. If they spoke to the reality of the card, it'd be clear why it's such an outlier in the EDH format. So, this is my ultimate issue with the card. It applies to the most basic of game actions, casting a spell, and turns the game into a maze of social pressure. From the perspective of somebody playing against it in a decent position, you can watch as your opponents all but hand the Rhystic Studying player a win. And from the perspective of somebody struggling in that game, you might be presented with a choice between attracting the ire of your non-studying opponents and not really getting to meaningfully play the game. I've heard some people describe it as a political tool, but really it's the opposite of most political tools. Instead of encouraging players to collaborate and make deals, it divides opponents and gets them to foster resentments amongst each other. One natural counterargument that you might be getting ready to type right now is that this can be a fun dynamic for a card to create, and I get where you're coming from. Prisoner's Dilemma is a decently popular damage spell for a reason. Sowing discord amongst your opponents can be a pretty good time. And I can't say there isn't something a little delightful about a blood feud being declared by a player who just took 12. However, you might remember that Rhystic Study's social dynamics are only part of my case for why it should be banned, with that other part being its power level. A disorder-creating card at a very high power level is quite a different story from one at a lower power. The stakes are quite high due to the card's extremely high power level, and as a result, Rhystic Study sows resentments, forges in-groups and out-groups, and intensifies the information density of the EDH format at a rate of no other card. It also shouldn't go unmentioned that the power level of Rhystic Study leads to it being played quite frequently, even with its game changer status, in addition to having massive implications for any game it exists in. This power level plus disorder interaction also manifests especially brutally for Rhystic Study because it lacks the intentionality of an actual politics card. The player base at large isn't running this card because they have a blast with its play patterns. They play it because it draws them a metric shitload of cards, and the negative play experiences sowed by the card are an incidental side effect. If you remember my Malphagor video, this is very similar to the reason I dislike the play pattern of Turgid decks. The oppressive tools Turgid encourages end up being impassive engine fodder, rather than tactically deployed instruments meant to handle the actual situation a player finds themselves in, and this ends up turning the destruction of opposing game plans into a frivolous side effect. Play patterns like this alienate players from the effects of what they're playing, replacing the tangibility of process and intent with something simpler and bleaker, the means to a powerful end. As with Just Pay the One lol, appealing to the supposed fascinating political implications of Rhystic Study is usually just a smokescreen to conceal the true, more basic motivations at play. So, in conclusion, yes, Rhystic Study should be banned. There's a solid argument that Smothering Tithes should join it, as another card that rapidly generates resources off of opponents taking basic game actions, but I won't delve more into that here. What I do want to discuss is the other camp of Rhystic Study defenders. Basically just the people saying, this card shouldn't be banned because it's a popular and iconic part of the format. I unfortunately can't really attack the topmost level of this argument. If within your prefrontal cortex lives the unshakable axiom that popular cards should stay unbanned, there's not a whole lot I can say to change your mind on Rhystic Study. What I can say is I find the underlying assumption, that popularity and iconicness should influence bannability, to be a little strange. Firstly, Rhystic Study is iconic in large part due to how unpleasant many people find it. Do you pay the one is an annoying thing to hear dozens of times. Obviously. Regarding its popularity, I find this a bit odd as well, since a card needs to be some level of popular to actually affect a lot of EDH games to be worth banning in the first place. You could make a card called Smoogle's Snot Gun that's the most annoying thing to ever exist, but it wouldn't be worth banning if only 12 people end up playing it. Things get even weirder when we dig into the implications of the popularity argument. One explanation for why Rhystic Study is so popular is that it's a very powerful card that wasn't banned by the RC at any point in the first couple decades of the format. This is interesting when we consider that another card, Primeval Titan, was banned 15 months after it was printed, and if it hadn't been banned, it would likely be an even more popular and even more iconic card than Rhystic Study. So, what do we make of that? In that alternate reality, would it be wrong to ban Primetime now? Are all ban decisions effectively being left up to whatever the RC wanted to do a decade or two ago, back when the format was largely a charming and slow-paced sideshow to other Magic events? It's just a very strange way to justify the decisions we're making in 2026. All this to say, the popularity or iconicness of a card should not be our primary concerns when it comes to the EDH ban list. These are understandable things to care about for somebody who produces Magic the Gathering content, who is intimately tied in with the tropes and the mythos and the paratext that surrounds the game. But those things are not the Commander format. Commander games are the Commander format, and we should be concerned with how a card impacts real EDH games that millions of people play. Does it have a positive impact to improve the experience of people playing this game, or does it do the opposite? What is the extent of that impact? How widespread? These are the actual questions worth asking about Rhystic Study, and I hope I've done an adequate job giving my answer to them in this video. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Archidekt for supporting the channel. Archidekt is my deck building website of choice, and one thing I like about it is how smoothly it integrates EDH Rec's salt scores into its design, letting you easily see both individual card salt scores and the aggregate salt score of a deck. A link to all of my decks is down in the description. Also supporting the channel is Dragon Shield. You can get yourself durable sleeves in a fabulously wide range of colors at my affiliate link down in the description, and you'll be helping out the channel in the process. Finally, big shout out to my supporters on Patreon and YouTube who give me the freedom to make 20-minute video essays about why I hate a specific card with my whole being. If you join, you'll get to vote on what card I say should be banned in my next video. Okay, that was a joke. Unless...